Hi, this is Matt Baker. In previous videos, we looked at 3 of the 4 foldout charts from my Timeline of World History book. We looked at Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Well, in this video, we're going to look at the final foldout chart, Europe. And I've got some great news. The book that contains all of these charts is now available on our own website. So you can buy the book at the same place that we sell our posters. Simply go to usefulcharts.com or click the link in the description or pinned comment. Okay, so like the other foldout charts, you first have to open the book and turn to the section you want to look at. The chart then opens up like this. Let's zoom in for a closer look. The Europe chart is color-coded as follows. Red is for Britain and Ireland, blue is for what will eventually become France, purple is for Germany, yellow is for the Iberian Peninsula, green is for Italy, and blue is for Greece. Other regions are added as you go down the chart, but these are the main ones that are there throughout. Like all of the foldout charts in the book, this one starts in the year 800 BCE. If you want to know what was happening in Europe prior to this date, you have to refer to the main chart, which also comes free with the book. It's located just behind the front cover and can be removed, unfolded, and referred to whenever you want. If you take a look at the main chart, you'll note that in terms of major civilizations, there weren't actually that many in Europe prior to 800 BCE. This is in contrast to areas such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China, where urbanization was more widespread. In Bronze Age Europe, the only urban civilizations were the Minoans, based on the island of Crete, followed by the Mycenaeans, based on mainland Greece. The transition between these two civilizations may have been connected to the massive volcanic eruption that occurred on the island of Santorini around 1600 BCE, which also birthed the well-known myth of Atlantis. Let's now return to 800 BCE on the foldout chart and proceed from there. In Western Europe, most areas were dominated by various Celtic tribes. Eventually, the Celts, who migrated to Britain and Ireland, developed their own unique cultures and languages, such as Brittonic and Gaelic. But the primary Celtic culture remained centered on the continent, in Gaul, which is today France. The peak of Celtic civilization in Europe occurred during the Latin period, from around 400 BCE to 50 BCE. Which is when the Celts were conquered by the Romans. The distantly related Germanic tribes started out confined to Scandinavia, but by 500 BCE, they were starting to move south into former Celtic territory. This map shows the division between Celtic tribes, shown in blue, and Germanic tribes, shown in yellow, around the year 50 BCE. The Romans initially tried to conquer the Germans, but failed to do so early on. Hence, they are shown on the chart as continuing, whereas the Celts are shown as being absorbed into the Roman Empire. As for the Mediterranean parts of Europe, 3 major civilizations dominated in ancient times: the Carthaginians, the Romans, and the Greeks. The Carthaginians were actually based in Africa, but developed colonies on the Iberian Peninsula, which is today Spain and Portugal. Rome started out as just one small city in Italy, but eventually grew and grew to become the dominant power there, and the main rival of the Carthaginians, eventually defeating them for good around 200 BCE. Greece, however, was arguably the most advanced civilization in all of Europe during classical times. The earlier Mycenaean civilization collapsed at the end of the Bronze Age, and was eventually replaced with many new city-states, the 2 most important being Sparta and Athens. It is at this point that Homer and his followers developed the Iliad and Odyssey, which describe the events that supposedly took place just prior to the collapse. In the 5th century BCE, Athens experienced a golden age in which many of the foundations of Western civilization were laid. Whether it's Western literature, philosophy, science, or history, it usually all starts with 5th century Athens. But ironically, both Sparta and Athens were eventually conquered by the Macedonians, who lived just north of them. It was the Macedonians, under the leadership of Alexander the Great, that spread Greek ideas all the way to India. But eventually, the Greeks were eclipsed by the Romans, and Rome ended up building the greatest empire that the world had ever seen. Eventually, most Romans converted to Christianity, a relatively new religion at the time that had spun off from Judaism. But remember how I pointed out that the Romans were unable to defeat the Germanic tribes early on? Well, that came back to bite them, because as their empire started to fall apart due to internal problems, it was the various Germanic tribes who took advantage of the situation, sweeping in to conquer the Western Roman Empire in 476. Soon thereafter, it was the Ostrogoths, meaning the East Goths, who set up a kingdom in Italy, but then later it was the Lombards. The Visigoths, aka the West Goths, took over what had been Hispania, and the Franks took over Gaul. To the north, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes invaded Britain, and the Norse dominated Scandinavia, eventually becoming known as the Vikings. Because so many people groups were moving around so much in Europe at this time, the entire period is generally referred to as the migration period. But it wasn't just in Western Europe that all this migration was taking place. Around the same time, Eastern Europe saw the arrival of several groups from Asia, such as the Avars, Bulgars, and Slavs. We'll come back to them a bit later. Of the various Germanic groups, all of whom were eventually Christianized, the Franks became the most powerful. They were ruled first by the Merovingians and then by the Carolingians. And in the year 800, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was also crowned emperor, becoming the first emperor in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. Which reminds me, I should actually point out that Rome didn't really fall. By 476, the empire had actually split into two, and in the east, Rome kept chugging along, now centered at Constantinople. Constantinople used to be called Byzantium, which is why the Roman Empire from this point forward is often referred to as the Byzantine Empire. But back to the Franks. The Frankish Empire eventually split into two main parts. West Francia went on to evolve into France, whereas East Francia, which held on to the title of emperor, went on to evolve into the Holy Roman Empire, which was mostly located in what is today Germany. But before we move on, let me point out what was happening in some of the other parts of Europe during the early Middle Ages. In the east, the Slavs established Poland, Bohemia, and Kievan Rus, whereas the Bulgars established the Bulgarian Empire, which at one point rivaled the nearby Byzantine Empire. Around this time, another group migrated into the area from Asia, the Magyars, who went on to establish the Kingdom of Hungary. Meanwhile, on the other side of the continent, the Iberian Peninsula was mostly taken over by followers of another new religion, Islam. There, the Caliphate of Cordoba was established, and a golden age was experienced by the Muslims who lived there, but also by the Jews. Today, those who descend from the Jews who lived in Spain during this time are known as Sephardic Jews. This is in contrast to Ashkenazi Jews, who initially lived in Germany. There was, however, one small Christian kingdom that held out against the Muslims in Iberia, the Kingdom of Asturias. It eventually evolved into the Kingdom of Leon, and then merged with Castile. Two more Christian kingdoms, Portugal and Aragon, also started to grow in Iberia and reconquer land from the Muslims in a process known as the Reconquista. Moving north, the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain eventually merged to become the Kingdom of England, and the various kingdoms in North Britain merged to become Scotland. Around the same time, a group of Vikings landed in France, where they became known as Normans. From there, they would go on to invade southern Italy and England as well. Okay, let's now look at what was happening across the continent during the 12th century, which was smack in the middle of the High Middle Ages. In Scandinavia, the original Viking lands had now evolved into three main kingdoms: Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. And England was doing particularly well. Because the Normans had previously taken over the throne there, their descendants, the Plantagenets, also known as the Angevins, controlled land in France, therefore giving England a bit of a mini empire. France was kind of struggling at this point, but the Holy Roman Empire was at its peak. It was also during this century that many European nobles traveled to the Holy Land to fight in the Crusades and set up what were essentially European colonies there. And as I already mentioned, there was also fighting between Christians and Muslims going on in Iberia during this period, with no side yet dominating. Italy was another place that was quite fractured during the High Middle Ages. The Pope and the Catholic Church pretty much controlled most of central Italy, but in the north, two republics, one based in the city of Florence and the other based in the city of Venice, started to really take off, especially in terms of economics and culture. This was in part due to the fact that Muslim armies had taken over much of the Byzantine Empire, resulting in many artists and scholars fleeing westward. It was also during the 12th century that most Ashkenazi Jews, having been kicked out of Western Europe, started to settle in Eastern Europe instead, where they would stay until the 19th and 20th centuries, which is when many of them migrated to America because of the pogroms, and of course when 2/3 of those remaining in Europe were murdered during the Holocaust. Let's now go back to the left side of the chart and look at each region from 1200 to today. In Scandinavia, there was a period of around 100 years, known as the Kalmar Union, when Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were united under a single monarch. But it came to an end when Sweden won its independence in 1523. Norway, however, remained united with Denmark until 1814, when it switched to a union with Sweden instead, before becoming independent in 1905. England eventually conquered Wales, and then united with Scotland to form Great Britain. At this point, Britain started to build an overseas empire that would go on to become the largest in all of world history, which is why so many of us speak English nowadays. One of the most important events to occur during the late Middle Ages was the Black Death, aka the bubonic plague, which was a major pandemic that wiped out around half of Europe's population. It occurred right in the middle of the 100 Years' War between France and England, which France eventually won. France went on to become the dominant power in Europe during the 1600s, under the reign of Louis XIV. But during the reign of his grandson, the French Revolution occurred, and France became a republic for a brief period, before the rise of Napoleon, who went on to conquer most of Europe. The other major powers eventually took him down, though, and after the Napoleonic years, things really changed throughout Europe due to the Industrial Revolution. France eventually did become a republic, though, and remains one to this day. Over in Germany, the Holy Roman Empire eventually came to be dominated by the House of Habsburg, which also ruled Spain for 200 years. It was in Germany in the 1500s that the Protestant Reformation began, which led to many new churches splitting away from the Catholic Church, and the 30 Years' War, after which a second major power emerged in Germany, Prussia. Eventually, Prussia became more powerful than the Holy Roman Empire, which, after Napoleon, evolved into the Austrian Empire. Prussia then evolved into the German Empire, which was one of the main players in World War I. The German Empire lost that war, though, and was therefore dismantled in the aftermath, which led to the rise of fascism and World War II. Okay, let's once again go back to 1200 and look at Iberia. The peninsula was eventually fully taken back from the Muslims, and around 1500, the two main Spanish kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, merged to become what we know today as Spain. There was also a brief period known as the Iberian Union when Spain held the crown of Portugal as well. But Portugal eventually won its independence, as did the Dutch Republic, which went on to become a major power in terms of overseas colonization. Compared to other parts of Europe, Italy took a much longer time to achieve political unification. However, it was ground zero for the Renaissance, which kind of serves as the dividing line between medieval Europe and modern Europe, and of course led to lots of innovations in literature, art, and culture. Eventually, Italy was unified in 1871, first as a kingdom, and then, following World War II, as a republic. Remember the Roman Empire, though? It had moved to Constantinople, and amazingly lasted all the way to 1453, when it was conquered by the Ottoman Turks. Greece went on to be ruled by the Ottomans until 1832. Hungary survived invasions both by the Mongols and then the Ottomans, but eventually its throne was inherited by the Habsburgs. Poland joined in union with Lithuania, but it was eventually eclipsed by the Tsardom of Russia, which became the Russian Empire. However, during World War I, the Bolsheviks led a revolution that led to the creation of the Soviet Union, which was one of the two main superpowers in the world for much of the 20th century. The Soviet Union broke up in the 90s, but to this day, Russia remains the dominant power in Eastern Europe. Okay, so that was a very brief overview of the general flow of European history. Like I always say, these timelines aren't meant to cover everything. They are simply designed to give you the lay of the land and to serve as a jumping off point so that you can then go on to explore the history of various places and times that are of particular interest to you. As I mentioned at the beginning, the book that contains this chart, as well as the charts for the other regions of the world, is now available on our website, usefulcharts.com. If you want a copy, you can head over there now. Thanks for watching.